Web forms are the holy grail of collecting information from your clients in a standardized way. This is a 45-minute live session I gave to not only get you comfortable with a couple web form builders, but to then automate what happens next. Woohoo! This is the 4th week in an 8-week series. Some of it builds on past weeks. Like at the end, we use an API connector to do some cool automation with the form submission. So you may want to check those weeks out if you haven't yet. Remember, you can get continuing education for this series. Check out the video description below, and let's build some forms.
We are on week 4, I think. We're talking web forms today. Web forms are a seemingly innocuous, really basic thing, but I think the reason that they're really important is so much of what we're learning and how we connect things and build business logic is dictated by the quality of the data that we're receiving and it being in a standardized format. And that's what makes web forms so critical. Is if you send somebody an email and they send you 20 things via email, you can never take automated steps based on that stuff that they just gave you. So the more we can lean into using forms, the more we can build business logic based on the info that people are giving us. Last week, we talked API connectors, which is the glue of a lot of the things that we work in. Today, we're talking web forms. Next time, we're talking image generation APIs. That's going to be a fun one. First, are you currently leveraging web forms in your firm? Not even a little bit, somewhat, or move over and let me present. I'll be honest here, I'm only using these somewhat. I could be using these much more than I am right now. Ooh, Jeremy tickling the present threshold. Oh, Logan's, yeah, get out of here, Logan. So if there's a downside to this format, it's that it's a whole bunch of me talking at you guys. But we have a lot of smart people here. And I am interested, and maybe the best place to do it's in the community, to learn how are people using it now to just get ideas going. Now, at this stage in the 8-week series, these are all sort of introductions to concepts. What are you most looking forward to doing a deeper dive on? Is it Airtable? Is it Zapier? Is it RPA? Is it not as much tool focus as building my internal processes or introducing external client-facing services that are totally automated? Or is it actually rolling up your sleeves and teaching these things to your clients? Because you guys are becoming the ultimate operator. A lot of Airtable, not surprised there. Internal processes, automated services, cool. I'm going to keep asking you guys this question throughout the 8 weeks. We can see how it ebbs and flows, and then that'll dictate what are the next things that we want to look at after 8 weeks. I'm not actually going to go through this slide. I built it out, and I think it's too much, and instead I'm going to soapbox for a minute. Obviously, the importance of web forms is it's how we collect data, and then based on that data, we can then automate certain actions. I think if there's a big opportunity for professional services in the next 5 to 10 years, it's not as much the tax tools we're using or this or that. Honestly, arguably the biggest opportunity is becoming more efficient in how we request information. Because a huge percentage of our profession right now is these zero value emailing back and forth. If there's a huge opportunity in terms of your efficiency, right now it's automatically answering intelligent questions. So I think that's a big difference between how a traditional CPA firm does things versus a novel tool like TurboTax. It's collecting all the information in a standardized way. And because it does that, it's able to complete the output in a standardized way. There are options on the market right now in terms of managing your client communication. And to me, what they're doing is they're replacing that normal email channel with a different channel. And maybe that channel is more secure and behind authentication, but it's still human beings pumping questions into there, and it's still human beings having to take the responses and do something with them. I think the opportunity isn't that. I think the opportunity is standardizing what all those requests are and then standardizing the steps you take based on those responses dynamically. I don't see tools doing that right now, but I think that's a place where our profession has a ton of room to grow. So web forms, reminder, capture data in a standardized format, request data automatically, auto follow-ups if they haven't given you what you need. If you think about a client base that's 1,000 clients, just the amount of time that goes into follow-ups is massive. And then something that we're doing very little of right now, automatically taking action based on those responses. So how do you build that logic into taking those steps automatically? Not all forms are made the same. So there's loads and loads of different form builder tools, and certain formats lend themselves better to certain types of requests. So I think Airtable, this is Airtable on the far left here. This is a traditional layout. It's just a feed of questions that you can all see at once. It's going to feel familiar to people. The person completing the form can see the other answers. And in some cases, that's helpful. Downsides, it may be bland, and actually showing them the entire form at once in some cases can be daunting and can decrease the likelihood that they're going to complete the entire thing. So you don't want to make forms humongous, but in general, people are actually less likely to complete that entire thing if you show them this giant list of things they have to do. A lot of times they'll stop before they even start. So sequential, this is Typeform's approach. And a big reason why they've taken this approach is just that. If you can show those questions sequentially, there isn't that intimidation factor of there being a giant laundry list of things to do. Upside is it looks nice. It plays really well on mobile because they're only showing one question at a time. Potential downside is you can't see the other answers that you've provided in the course of completing that form. And then lastly, this is a tool called Anvil that has a different approach. And this is going to look a little more like the sort of web forms you fill out if you're checking out on Amazon or setting up an online account or something like that. It's a little more condensed. It's a good way to efficiently capture a lot of data. It's also very useful when a lot of the fields will be empty. So if you think about how your tax organizer works, capturing Schedule C data or Schedule E data, this format would lend itself well to that because it's a lot of fields, some of which are going to be empty. Downsides is it can look intimidating if you have a lot of stuff on there. And then if you are routing the data afterwards automatically, it's a lot of data points to set up routing for. Good use cases and bad use cases for web forms in general. Web forms are suited for what you know as opposed to what you have. So distinction there is, a questionnaire that is just something that your client knows versus 100 documents. They can tell you what they know off the top of their head. They can't give you what they have in a brief session. And that's what web forms are. Unless you break up your web forms into being several separate forms, it's something that somebody has to be able to do in one sitting. It's better suited for the things that they know than the things that they have. It's not to say that you can't use it for document collection. It's just something to keep in mind. Ideally, it's something they can knock out in 5 minutes or less. And it's best used when they're trying to get something from you. So if there's no incentive for them to complete this, they're not going to complete it. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about the ways to collect information. Fundamentally downstream, there has to be some sort of deliverable that's incentivizing them to actually complete this for you. Bad use cases, yeah, it's worth keeping in mind. Generally, there is not a way to save progress in a web form. A workaround there is if you have a long process, you can break it out into several different web forms that are sequential. And so it's really like several form submissions. But in general, you're not going to have a way to save the progress of a web form. So you're thinking about that when you're thinking about how much do I want to build into this? Maybe it's helpful to you to build a whole bunch of stuff into that form. But if it reduces the completion rate by 50%, are you really any better off? So that's always something to kind of weigh as you're completing it. Best practices, start with the tools that you already have. Everybody and their mom has a web form builder. ShareFile has a web form builder. Office 365 has a web form builder. A lot of them are not good. The thing to keep in mind is there a good enough API there for you to actually leverage the data that you're collecting to create forms automatically, to take actions based on the decisions automatically? Keep that in mind, but always start with the tools that you have before you add a bunch of new tools. Pre-fill forms wherever possible. If there's something that you already know about somebody, drop it in that box automatically. Most form tools will let you do that. That's going to make it easier on the user and prevent conflicts in your data. The smaller the better. Separate out larger forms when necessary. Consider what you actually want to collect via a form. Asking for sensitive information generally is not a good idea unless that tool lives inside of something that's already fundamentally secure, like a share file or something like that. That being said, you could still inside of a form builder link out to a secure file upload. Just be thinking about whether or not you actually want those secure details in the form itself. And then always look for great APIs, because without a great API, you can't wire things up together. You don't have access to that data to be able to take steps based on responses. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to jump back to that client intake Airtable base we were using last week. So previously on whatever this is, so the purpose of this base was to put a form on your website where prospective clients could fill it out, tell you a bit about themselves, and then you decide if you want to take a meeting with them or not. And so we built out the base for that, but we didn't actually build out the form for that. So the bottom left-hand side here, you're just going to click form to create a new form view. So I'm going to click form, and by default, it's going to pull all of the fields in the entire base into this form. So this is our starting point. And if I looked at it now, if I said open form, it'd be pretty ugly. It doesn't have any like contextual explanation of what it is or why you need that information. So the first step is to build out the narrative of what this form is. So I'm going to say, thanks for reaching out to whatever your firm is, and then say, please provide a few details about yourself, and we will follow up with a calendar appointment. So wherever possible, try to make this personal. So I'm going to say your first name, and then each of these fields are probably going to be required. So there's a toggle here that is by default off. I'm going to toggle that on, and once it's required, you'll see a red asterisk right here. You can add branding and all sorts of other kind of visual styling here. We're just going to skip over that. I'm going to ask for your last name. The only reason I separated this first and last name field out is because if you remember last week, after they complete this, we send them an email. And in that email, in the salutation, I just want to say their first name. I'm actually going to pull the email up towards the top because that's something that I want them to give me no matter what. In Airtable, it's easy to just drag these around on whatever sequence you want. Annual revenue, and then accounting system. So that's all pretty straightforward. You've got a few more options down at the bottom of this form. Do you want it to show the Airtable branding? Obviously, there's a pricing tier there where you can turn it off. Do you want to redirect to a specific URL after the form is submitted? What message do you want it to display when it's done? That sort of thing. This can be either shared via a direct link. Alternatively, you can embed this directly onto your website, which is probably the more likely way that you would use this. So I'm going to click embed this form on your site. Virtually every website builder gives you the ability to drop in embed code. So you would copy this code into code blocker and embed block in your website builder, and it's going to put this form inside of a page on the website itself. It's going to be responsive, so it'll look good on mobile and on desktop. One other thing I'll show you here is conditional logic. You may not be able to do this on the free Airtable plan, but one of the options I have here when I select, say, this business name question, I don't actually want them to see this if they don't have a business. So I'm going to toggle on show field only when conditions are met. And again, you may not see this on the free plan. And I'm going to say when do you own a business is checked. Then I want them to see that. Same thing with all of these subsequent questions. I only want them to see it if do you own a business is checked. Now, you could go wild with this. You could build out all sorts of additional logic based on, say, the entity type. So if they say they're an S Corp, maybe you ask a follow-up question for what payroll system do you use? right now. So the logic in Airtable is fairly basic. When we get to Typeform next, we'll see there's a little more kind of branching logic opportunities there. But always show that client the minimum. You're always in a battle here to make it as easy as possible for them and increase the likelihood that they're actually going to complete the entire thing. So now when I open this form, it actually doesn't show any of those business questions until I check this box to say, do I own a business? We talked about pre-filling forms. So I'm going to go to the support article for Airtable pre-filled forms. Wherever possible, you want to complete as much of that form for somebody as you can ahead of time. And in Airtable, this can be achieved by adding parameters to the URL itself. So here's the URL for that Airtable link. I'm going to copy that into a new tab. And let's say I want to pre-fill the first and last name. Here you have the vanilla URL, and then you use a question mark and then pre-fill underscore. So I'm going to add question mark, pre-fill underscore. And then you put the name of the field. So in this case, for me, it's going to be first name with a plus where the space normally is. So I'm going to say first name equals Jim. See if I did that right. Okay, so now you'll see Jim has automatically been populated in the first name field, and you can add as many of these as you want. So I'm going to say ampersand pre-fill underscore last name equals Smith. So now you've got Jim Smith in there. If you have a form that has a standard set of fields, a lot of things you're already going to know for people, or if you're asking them if their address changed, stuff like that, you can pre-populate the fields based on data that you already have. Now, are you going to be manually entering things into the URL when you send them these links? Good God, no. This is going to be part of the process when those links are sent out. It's going to grab the name from another system, add it to the URL, send it out. That is Airtable Forms. If you're getting started with this and you're liking Airtable so far, Airtable is such an easy way to start with forms. So I would say maybe start there because it's just so easy to create them. And it's really nice having both the database and the form in one easy to access place. So upstream from this, we've got this base, we've got the form and all that. But before this, you got to figure out what do you want to ask and what's the logic that dictates what questions people should see. And the easiest place for me to do this is inside of Miro. So you don't have to do this with me. I'm just going to make a new Miro board and just kind of scroll out real quick what my process is to build something like this. Client intake, we already thought through that, but what is the equivalent of that client intake form for you? What are the questions that you want to ask? So you're always going to ask for name. You're always going to ask for email. I'll use the logic of a tax firm here, but you could do something similar for a bookkeeping group or a CAS service when you're thinking about bookkeeping services, plus do they want bill pay, do they want payroll, that sort of thing. So I'm going to say, do they have a small biz? And then in the example we just created, if they didn't, then it just, at that point you were done, or it takes you to the thank you screen. And so this is logically how I build this out before I even get to building a form tool. And the client intake example is pretty simple because we've been through this already, but this is just my process. So I'm going to say no on this path here. And then now we have a secondary path where if they do, what is your business type? If you put this into production, you're probably going to have a few more paths here. So the obvious ones are, say, 1040, S Corp, partnership, but maybe you've also got an option here for a trust and estate. Now, depending on how they respond to this question, you're probably then going to set up some additional downstream logic. So maybe you do trust work, but you don't want to touch a 706. Completely reasonable thing. So maybe there's another question here that's something along the lines of, do you need a 706 filing? Or you can even make it more abstract than that. You can make the question, is the total estate going to be in excess of X number of dollars approximately? Because maybe they don't know if they need a 706 filing or not. If this is a $20 million estate and you don't want to touch 706s, then having this additional logic means that downstream you can send them an auto response that says, hey, we're not a great fit, but based on these things that you learned about them in the form, you can include in that email a link to a firm that will do 706, that sort of thing for them. There's a million use cases for forms, but this is how they start, I think. This is the easiest way to begin that process. This could be your 1040 questionnaire. It could be an annual questionnaire that goes to your business clients. I think this is the best place to start with it. And then you start building this logic into your actual form builder. Okay, let's hop into Typeform. So typeform.com, it's best if you can do this along with me. I think you can actually do anything. And if you do anything that takes you into the paid features, it'll just automatically kick you over to a trial. So I click the blue deal here, new Typeform. Typeform's like a creative designer friendly tool. There's a lot of really cool designs. And if this is something as an accountant that you're not capable of, which will be the case for most of us, your best place to start may be with a template that you can modify. So you can see a live demo of the templates here. In our case, for simplicity, since we're all doing the same thing at the same time, we're going to hit this black button up here that says start from scratch. So you got to give it a name. I'm going to say my first Typeform. Okay, so general layout in Typeform is on the left-hand side, you build your list of questions. On the right-hand side, you have this live preview of what your form looks like. So I'm going to add my first question, and I'm going to start with a welcome screen. So this is the first thing they see when they hop in. You can add an image right here, but I'm going to stick with the example of a client intake form because this can also be embedded on your website and say, nice to meet you. Please provide us with a few details. Now, you're going to list out a bunch of questions on the left-hand side, but to get to the nitty-gritty settings for each question, you hit this little wrench. So I'm going to say question settings, and now I've got this third panel on the left. This is where you add an image. You can change the text that's on the button. And so I'm going to say, change that to, let's do it. All the styling, all that stuff, you can make whatever you want and even templatize so that all your forms look the same. So I'm going to add the next question, and I'm just going to make this a short text type question. So these are all of your different types of questions that you can ask, not unlike field types in Airtable, fundamentally, is what this is. So you got file upload, payment, opinion scale. They could choose a picture. We're going to keep things simple. Say short text and say have one for first name. And then in the panel on the left-hand side here, I'm going to be sure to mark that one required. And then a second question for last name. It's going to be another short text question for last name. And toggle that to required. Now, an interesting design pattern that's possible when you have these sequential form designs like in Typeform is you can have these breaks, or you can tell them something on a page based on the answers that they've given you so far. So I'm going to add a new screen that is a statement type question, even though it's not a question. And I'm going to say, great, nice to meet you. And then I can use the @ sign and refer back to an answer on another question. So I'm going to say, nice to meet you, first name. Now, here I'm going to use the description field. So I'm going to toggle description on. And this is a place to put like smaller text beneath the main header text of that question. So I'm just going to say a few more details. Okay. So we'll just add a couple other questions that are along the lines of what we had in the Airtable form. First, we need to do a check or a yes, no for do they have a small business? So I'm going to hit the plus here, say yes, no. Do you run a small business? So they're going to answer yes or no there. And then next, I'm going to ask them, and this is a drop down type question. What type of business do you own? Could say S Corp, partnership, sole proprietorship. I'm not sure. And then I'm going to add one more. I guess we want to mark all these required. Then I'm going to add one more question for annual revenue. So it's going to be a number type. Say, what is your approximate annual revenue? Okay, so to preview this form, you can click this little eyeball up here in the top right. So nice to meet you. Please provide us with a few details. You would put some branding in here to make this you. First name, Jim Smith. This is a novelty of Typeform. I think like it's a very nice user experience that works really well on mobile too. And then you have nice touches like this, where this isn't really a question, it's more of a break. And you could even add these breaks. Say they said they were an S Corp and that was your favorite thing. You could have a statement page after that S Corp question that says, we love working with S Corps. We work with X number of S Corps in this region. Tell us a couple more details about yourself. Stuff like that to make it a little more of a high touch experience rather than just a bunch of questions. Do you run a small business? Yes. Yada, yada. So in 5 or 10 minutes, we've built out what we had in Airtable there. The one other thing I'll show you here is how Typeform does branching logic. So the way Typeform works is depending on an answer, you then jump to another question, depending on what that answer is. So where we set that logic jump is actually on the do you run a small business question. So I'm going to click logic jump. I'm going to add a logic jump. If do you run a small business is no, then I just want to jump to the end. So then jump to default end. So on the right-hand side, you've got this kind of visual flow here. Do you run a small business? If the answer is no, it's going to jump straight to thanks for completing this form. If the answer is yes, it's actually going to just complete the normal flow. What type of business? What's your approximate revenue? That sort of thing. So I'm going to click the eyeball again, make sure that works as we expected. Let's do it. Do you run a small business? Yes. It's going to take me to what type of business do I own? If I answer that no, it took me straight to the end of the form. So that's Typeform in a nutshell. If you have a paid plan, you can customize this final screen as well. And you can even set it to redirect to some other place. Like maybe you've got a landing page for S Corps on your website that you can hand it off to after that or something like that. All of the logic we set up last week in terms of scoring, reaching out with the Calendly link of that subject matter expert in your form, all that's going to be possible with Typeform as well, using an API integrator like Zapier or Integromat. So pretty simple. Really building the forms is not hard. The more involved part that takes some forethought and where the real opportunity is deciding where do I build these type forms. Client intake's a really easy example. That's a great use case. Having a careers page on your website where people can submit an inquiry, that's a great use case. But where do you start building this into productized services? So an easy example that everybody does is just about everybody has their 1040 questionnaire. So I think the place to start when you're thinking through how to set something like this up is in a mapping tool like Miro, where you decide of all of the questions that I know I want to ask, of who do I want to ask these questions? I would say 95% of tax firms right now have a standard set of questions that they ask every single client that they have. And it limits how deep you can go on questions, because if you go really deep on questions, then it means you're going to be asking more questions that aren't relevant to a bunch of people. Problem is, if you don't ask those questions, you're then going to have to follow up with all those questions later on for every single client. If you don't go very deep with the questions, then more of the questions are relevant to everybody, but then downstream, you're then asking all the same questions of those people again. So logic jumps are a great way to get more granular about the questions that you ask without making that questionnaire less relevant to everybody. This is something we could probably all be better at. Our tax suites do not handle this sort of thing. They don't let you build dynamic questionnaires like this. But with vanilla Typeform, your 1040 questionnaire is a great example of something you could design tomorrow in Typeform with the logic that you want. It would let you go deeper than you've ever gone before. And it will keep the actual form size shorter than they've ever been before, because you're only asking them the questions that matter, not the questions that don't. Be thinking about that. I think that's something that honestly anybody can dive into. But then the next step, which is I think more interesting, is what do you do with that data? Now, if all you do is email it to an admin person to put in that work paper file in the right place, honestly, that's probably a big step still from just asking standardized questionnaires. The really exciting things are what are the steps you want to take based on each specific response. And that's where connecting this as part of a process in an API connector can be really exciting, because every time they respond to this form, you can say, did they provide this answer to this question? And if they did, maybe you've got a question about, did they sell any crypto, or did they have any cryptocurrency activity in the year? And if you don't just want to then send them an email that's going to fire them, you can instead send them a follow-up email that says, have a conversation with our cryptocurrency expert, and that sort of thing. So building that business logic that lives in your brain that is often mistaked for this mystical expertise, build that into here so that stuff happens automatically and is not something that a human being is going to have to come in and touch every single time. Now, I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about the client request framework that I know people are geeked on, but is a big project. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, how that works. The big difference there is everything we've talked about so far are statically generated forms. They all have a fixed set of questions. You can jump between questions in a logical way, and that's cool. But the next step beyond that, and this is an advanced concept, is generating those forms in a unique way for every single client or every single request. Typeform's API makes this possible. This isn't possible with Airtable's API, but Typeform's API enables you to build a form from scratch that you would only send once to one person. And that's really powerful if you think about being more explicit about how you define your requests. So rather than sending somebody an email asking for 20 things and then having to follow up manually for those things, and they're going to respond to 13 of them and then forget about the other 7, and then somebody has to come back and say, hey, you didn't give us these ones. Being able to dynamically generate forms at any given point in time for only the things that you need, it's a really powerful concept, and it's something that's possible with Typeform's API. So I'll give you a high level look at how this looks. You can try to follow along, but I'm just going to rapid fire through this because, again, it's a big concept. It's something that I think I'll probably build out into like an on-demand series after the 8 weeks, because it's so meaty and technical that you're probably going to want to just be able to go through the video rather than it working great in a format like this. Here's the basic idea behind how it works. So I'm inside of Integromat here, and I'm going to use Typeform in this process. So Typeform, one of the actions it lets us do is create a form. So what are all the options that go into creating a form? You better believe it's going to be a crap ton of options. You can set the title for it. I'm going to call this test form. And you've got loads of options here, most of which I'm going to gloss past. I'm going to set it to public, which means the link it generates is actually going to be accessible. But you got all sorts of stuff from, do you want the progress bar to look proportional or as a percentage? I don't really care. Nice things that will let you do, you can set up a branding template and then you just reference that branding theme via URL. So if you want the font to be a specific way, the coloring to be a specific way, you can set that up once and then always reference the URL of that theme. That's pretty cool. But the main meat of this is your fields. So under fields here is where you set up questions. So I'm going to add a question that is, we may as well just stick with what we've done. So first name, and this is going to be a short text response, and it's required. We can add any number of fields here. So these are all of the questions that we're asking of people. Last name, short text, required. Let's do something more interesting. How about the example that I used was Bench, the bookkeeping group, has an interface that shows all of the kind of ask my accountant sort of transactions, shows the bank statement line, and then it gives you a few suggestions of, is this office expense or advertising or something else? And the example I used when I first started talking about this concept was an engine to send those requests to clients. So let's say we're asking for categorization help. So how should we categorize this transaction? And I'm going to make this a multiple choice question. I'm going to put in the description, I'm going to put the bank statement line. So maybe this is 1, 2, 3, 4 McDonald's. And then I'm going to add choices. So these are basically the multiple choice suggestions I'm making. So this may be meals. This may be advertising, right? Sure. Maybe it's entertainment. I don't want to allow multiple selection. I just want them to pick one option. Randomize. No, I want them to follow the sequence I put here because maybe I think the most likely one is the top one. Allow other choice. I'm going to say yes. This allows them to, under these options, enter their own response. So maybe they're not sure, but they could still provide some context that way. And then vertical alignment, that's fine. And I'm going to require it. Okay, so we've got a custom built form here with 3 questions. I'm going to say, okay, let's try to generate this. And because this is live, hopefully this works. So I'm going to hop over to my Typeform account and see if we've got a new form there. So here it is, test form. I'm going to hit the eyeball to preview it. And here are all of the questions that we set up. JSON stats, how should we categorize this transaction with the options that we put in here, and other if we want to enter our own. What did we just do? We, via API, created a one-off form for that client with a unique set of requests. Now, how would you put something like this in production? First, you probably need a place to manage all of your requests. So the first step here is probably going to be a database with requests, not actually Typeform itself. So let's make the first step Airtable. So I'm going to pull this recurrence thing over to Airtable, and now Airtable is going to be our trigger rather than Typeform. And you're going to design an Airtable base that contains all of the specifics of that question that you would ask. So here's something I threw together this morning. So every request is itemized as a record here, and they're all going to be associated with a client from the client table. They're going to have a question type. So here I've got multiple choice, open-ended, or file upload. What's the question? And then if it's multiple choice, what are the option suggestions you're going to give them? And then the first step of this process is going to be pull all of those records from Airtable. And then what you're actually going to do is you're going to map, and this is honestly the gnarliest part of this process, is you build those records into a JSON file format. That's basically the exact format that Typeform wants to see those in. And instead of manually entering these things out here, instead you're going to map it to that basically a little block of code that you just made. So this is the only maybe gnarly technical part of this process. Is there's a step in between here that aggregates each of those requests into the exact format that Typeform wants to see it in, and then you drop it into this form here. Now, this is an example of something that we could absolutely build once in community, and then anybody could plug into this. But that's the magic of this, because take a step back, think about all the ways you can get info, you can get requests into this base. So you can create a staff-facing form where your staff people submit requests that they want to be sent to the client. Upstream of that, you could even create an approval workflow internally before those requests actually go to the client. So maybe you've got junior staff that are asking questions of the client, and you may not be comfortable with that yet. You can add an extra step to approve those before they're pushed into that live workflow. And then realistically, the ultimate realization of this is then what happens when they respond. So you would have a secondary process here that's going to trigger every time somebody responds to that type form. And associated with each question is going to be, what action do we take based on that response? And this could go as far as coding a transaction inside of your accounting system. It could simply send that information to the person that needed that info, or it could be to save a file to a file location, something like that. That's the idea behind the client request framework. I know every time I ask what we should look at more, it's always this, and this is like the most popular thing that people want to dig into more. After this 8 weeks, there's going to be more asynchronous stuff, I think, because we're going to be getting into tax season. Realistically, people can't come and do workshops every single week during tax season. So that's probably going to transition to being a more asynchronous thing. But this is something that will probably be, a series of 4 to 6 20-minute videos or something like that. And we can show you how to build this out. And maybe even the destination is a shared resource where anybody can connect to this and leverage it. At the very least, you get your head around the notion of being able to build your own form ad hoc, send it to your clients via email, via text, that sort of thing. This is getting more towards what I think that next iteration of requesting information looks like. It's not requesting information in this new channel rather than email. It's having standardized libraries of the things that you request, and then standardized sets of actions based on those responses. It's definitely an abstract concept. Asking questions is not abstract, and we'll put out some more materials around this specifically in the future, but I know this is something people are excited about. So there's 10 minutes on how you would approach the next step of building something like that. Okay, wrapping things up here. Always be thinking in terms of destinations. If somebody tells you a thing, what are you actually going to do with it? And can you do it automatically? Because that's the value of the form, is being able to automate the steps you take after that. So always think in terms of destinations. Can you send that file to your file system automatically via Zapier and Integromat, something like that? Can you automatically generate something of value? We're going to talk about this next week with image generation APIs. Interacting with your customers while you sleep. So getting away from you having to be the one to send the follow-up reminder or send those questions yourself. And then ultimately, wherever you can, you want to automate decisions. So a few use cases. We talked about client intake here. I think if you implemented something like client intake, the logical next step would be that next client discovery session. So you or a staff person is going to go through the conversation with that client. And what are the things that they need to be sure to ask during that conversation? You can also build an internal form for that. And maybe the result of that is a more refined score for that client. And maybe then out of that, it'll generate the pricing and the proposal and that sort of thing. I think that's probably the logical next step there. Same thing for hiring. You could have a very basic hiring intake form and then a standardized form you want the person who does the interview to complete, the questions that you always need to ask. Approvals and requests, standardized questionnaires like your 1040 questionnaires. Payments. Do your clients have a way to make payments online right now? This takes 90 seconds to set up. Like you can have a payment form on your website that integrates with Stripe. They have to put an invoice number in, stuff like that. It's not perfect, but you could post those back to QBO automatically. There's things you could do with that. Basic checkout, calculators, pushing data into complex systems and requesting data out of complex systems. So I'll give you an example right now. So in my firm, we've built an RPA bot to interface with this regional bank that has no integrations with anybody. But we have like 60 clients on this awful bank, and we have to go in and grab all of these things over and over again. So we built an RPA bot to do that. It goes out, navigates the website, gets the stuff that we want it to get for us. That's helpful, but how do the people that actually need that data interface with the bot? They don't know anything about the bot, how it works, or anything like that. What they can do is they can actually submit a form that says, I want you for this client to get me this account thing on this recurrence. And they can submit that via a form. And then that's going to go into the system that manages how the bot runs. And the bot's going to send that to them or put it in the file system on the recurrence that they indicated. So forms are a good way to oftentimes simplify your interface with something that may otherwise be complex or confusing. Lastly, reporting. That's what we're getting into next week. So next week, image generation APIs. If we're going to get through this and 6 months from now, stumble into this really cool automated service we can offer to our clients, like scorecarding or something like that, it's going to happen via image generation APIs. So these APIs cost less than a penny to generate an image. So think about all of the data that you have and the arbitrage between what it costs you to create that visual and what somebody would pay you for it. So that could be a tax return summary. That could be, a set of KPIs. Could be anything. It's totally up to you. But they can be generated automatically with zero user input. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. And we'll be hands-on with Banner Bear, actually building out a template. That'll be next Tuesday. We're taking a week off after that because Thanksgiving things. And then we'll be back the week after that for RPA. So that's it. That's web forms.
How fun was that? Hey, we're doing this fun every week. Check out the whole playlist for this whole weekly series and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a week.